Hi, and welcome to Trust and Obey with Chuck Frank. We are studying the book of Esther, and today we're going to be studying Esther Chapter 5. And this is a chapter that shows God's providential hand everywhere. So we're looking at a Rembrandt painting of the first banquet that Queen Esther holds for King Ahasuerus and his prime minister, Haman. And this has a decidedly Dutch feel to it. But listen, we appreciate all these grand masters and how they depict these biblical scenes. Let's go. Esther plans a banquet. Now it came about on the third day that Esther put on her royal robes. So let's just stop there. Remember that Esther has asked all the Jews in all the provinces to fast for 3 days, and the majority of them are in sackcloth and ashes. So it appears that Esther must have been at least in sackcloth, and it's the third day. She's the third day of the fast, and she's putting on her royal robes, meaning she had not been wearing them for this fasting. So it says, Esther put on her royal robes and stood in the inner courtyard of the king's palace in front of the king's rooms. And the king was sitting on his throne in the throne room. So she's not in the throne room. She's in an anteroom next to the throne room, but he can look from his throne and see that she has come into the inner courtyard, which is the violation. Unless you're invited, nobody comes into that inner courtyard to see what's going on with the king. And the king, the sentence for this is death immediately, unless he holds out his golden scepter. Unless he acknowledges you and holds out the scepter. So he's sitting on his royal throne in the throne room opposite the entrance to the palace. And here's where God's providential hand comes in. When the king saw Esther, the queen, standing in the courtyard, she obtained favor in his sight. And the king extended to Esther the golden scepter, which was in his hand. So if he had not acknowledged her, if he had ignored her, then she would have been dragged away and killed immediately. And this was the moment. And the fact that he saw her and that he extends the golden scepter, and we're going to see what he had to say to her. So here's a depiction of Esther looking overcome. She's white with absolutely pale. Could have been partially from the fasting, could also just be from all of the high emotion of not knowing if she was going to be executed or accepted. And so this is a painting of Esther in the inner court on the right, being supported by her two servants, and the king elevated above everybody on the throne, extending the golden scepter. So the verse continues, so Esther approached and touched the top of the scepter. Then the king said to her, what is troubling you, Queen Esther? And what is your request? Up to half of the kingdom, it shall be given to you. So a lot of things going on here. She touches the end of the golden scepter. And then the king says, what is troubling you? Meaning you wouldn't come here and risk your life on a lark. Something is going on that you would take this huge chance, Queen Esther. So he gives her honor and calls her the queen. And he's trying to establish her and make her feel that she's okay. And he says, and what is your request? What's troubling you, and what's your request? And then he goes, up to half of the kingdom it shall be given to you. This was a standard saying when the king really wanted to let somebody, he has no intention of giving up half his kingdom, but he wants to say it in a manner of hyperbole to let her know, you're really, really important to me. And Esther said, if it pleases the king, may the king and Haman come this day to the banquet that I have prepared for him. So this king is a drunkard and a skirt chaser, but maybe he's not so stupid. He knows she just took her life in her hands, and she would not take her life in her hands to get them to come to a banquet in her quarters. So he knows something's not right. There's another painting of Esther bowing before the king and touching the golden scepter. And I'll go back to that because it's critical. She asked 1 million Jews to fast for 3 days and to pray. And they were all praying for her, and she was fasting, and her staff was fasting. And they're praying. Who are they praying to? They're praying to God that he will intervene. And wow, does he intervene, not just in the wonderful way that King Ahasuerus welcomes her, but in everything to follow. His hand is all over this. Then the king said, bring Haman quickly so that we may do as Esther desires. Now, why would he say that? He's saying that because he has a sense that something is way not right. Why would she risk her life to have the king and Haman come to brunch? I mean, it doesn't make any sense. So the king says, hurry up, let's get to this banquet because I want to find out what is going on and why my wife would risk her life for this banquet and why she wants Haman included. So the king and Haman came to the banquet which Esther had prepared. As they drank their wine at the banquet, the king said to Esther, what is your request? For it shall be granted to you. And what is your wish? Up to half the kingdom it shall be done. So this is Ahasuerus, who is not a detail guy, basically saying, get Haman here quickly. I want to find out what's going on. And they get in and they start drinking wine. They go through all the initial social cues, and the king's he's not releasing this. He's saying, what's going on? What is your request? And what is your wish? There's something. This doesn't make any sense. Here's another painting. This is at Esther's banquet. And I don't know who painted this, but these costumes are wild. And Esther it's just funny looking to me, these costumes. But it's a great painting. It's a great perspective. The table's all tilted so that we can see what's on it. And it's just the three of them, right? With the servants looking from a pantry in the back, wondering what's going on and what's going down, because they know that Haman created this decree. They know that the king signed it, and they know that Esther is a Jew and therefore would be killed, but these other two guys don't know that fact yet. And so there's high drama back here in the pantry. So Esther replied, my request and my wish is, if I have found favor in the sight of the king, and if it pleases the king to grant my request and do what I wish, may the king and Haman come to the banquet which I will prepare for them, and tomorrow I will do as the king says. So that's an even more confounding answer for King Ahasuerus, because the drama is building and she's saying, Well, I want you to come to another banquet. And here again, we have God's providential hand. Somehow, he's letting Esther know not to pull the trigger on this yet, that there's something else that still needs to happen, and it will. And it increases the drama. And it increases King Ahasuerus' sense that something profound is happening to his wife. And she is not coming forth and saying it. And she risked her life not to have 2 luncheons in her chambers. So we're getting to a climax here. It says, then Haman went out that day joyful and pleased of heart. Why would he be so joyful and pleased of heart? Well, he's the number 2 guy in the greatest empire that's ever been assembled by human beings. And he's being asked by the queen to come to private luncheon with just Haman, the king, and the queen. And he thinks this is it. It doesn't get any better than this until I'm the king. So it says, Haman went out that day joyful and pleased of heart. But when Haman saw Mordecai, because he had to go through the gate, and Mordecai sitting outside the gate in sackcloth and ashes, wailing, and Mordecai at the king's gate, and that he did not stand up or tremble before him, Haman was filled with anger against Mordecai. Haman controlled himself, however, and went to his house, but he sent for his friends and his wife Zeresh. Then Haman told them of the glory of his riches and his many sons, and every occasion on which the king had honored him, and how he had promoted him above the officials and servants of the king. So this guy is such a narcissist that he gets home and he wants all of his friends to come by to hear, guess what? The queen invited me to private lunch with her and the king, and now she's asked me to come again because they value my company so much. So he has no clue what is happening around him. He's just in a terrible situation, but he's gloating and bragging. And this is, again, how God's pattern is. When he hardens the heart of people, then they do outrageous things because they want nothing to do with him. They want nothing to do with his people. And they are absolutely sure that they are going to be all powerful. That's what happens when your heart gets hardened. All right. So then Haman also said, even Esther the queen, let no one except me come with the king to the banquet which she had prepared. And tomorrow also I am invited by her with the king. So this guy, he's like, it doesn't get any better than that. He goes, yet all of this does not satisfy me every time I see Mordecai the Jew sitting at the king's gate. So this is the narcissism of this guy. All these wonderful things are happening to him, but because this one older Jewish guy will not bow to him, it's all ruined for him. And then Zeresh, his wife, and all his friends said to him, have a wooden gallows, 50 cubits high made, that's 90 feet high, and in the morning ask the king to have Mordecai hanged on it, then go joyfully with the king to the banquet. What kind of wonderful wife and friends are these? That they go, oh, you're feeling bad even though you're going to these private luncheons and you're the number 2 guy in the Persian Empire, and There's one old Jewish guy will not bow to you. Well, look, here's a great idea. Make a 90-foot gallows, and then in the morning, tell the king that you'd like to have Mordecai hanged on it, and then go joyfully with the king to the banquet, right? Hang Mordecai and go to the banquet. These people, man, talk about hardened hearts. And the advice pleased Haman, so he had the wooden gallows made. And this is God's providential hand, because that gallows is going to become important. And his wanting to request that Mordecai be hanged, and all of this he thinks is a fantastic idea. And look, we can't look at these people and their responses to things in our contemporary visage, let's put it that way. Well, here's a slide showing you how awful and cruel these people were. This is a relief in bronze from 900 BC showing a gallows on the right that was built with people's heads mounted all over it. And then they did have crucifixion on crosses, but more often than not, they would just take a 10-foot stake and sharpen the point end of it. And sometimes they'd shove that point up under the sternum of the person. And in this particular thing, they're showing a custom that they did of cutting the hands and feet off people before they crucify them. Some get the point of the shaft up the sternum. This poor guy on the right here got it right up between his legs. And this other guy's being prepared for the whole thing. And these are the brutal, awful people. And most of the time before they did this stuff, they skinned people alive. So these were just brutal pagan cultures. All right, so that's the end. I just want to reinforce some other opinions on God's providential hand. And the reason I'm doing this is because so many scholars say, God's name's not mentioned once in this whole thing. And that's not a fair assessment of God and his presence and the fact that Esther is fasting and praying and asking 1 million people to fast and pray. And Mordecai is saying that if she doesn't go to the king's chamber and risk her life, that rescue will come some other way from God and she'll be lost. So let's look at some statements from the Bible about God's providential hand. This is Romans 8:28. And we know that God causes all things, and that means all things, to work together for good to those who love God, to those who are called according to his purpose. So that's a broad verse, and it doesn't mean that in all situations that there'll be a good outcome for you individually, but broadly, the outcome will ultimately lead to good. And then from Proverbs 21:1, the king's heart is like channels of water in the hand of the Lord. He turns it wherever he wishes. So we see that when Esther comes unannounced to the inner chambers, God's already turned Ahasuerus' heart. He hasn't called her in 30 days. He hasn't given her a thought. But when he sees her, he's like, oh, yeah, wow, I have this gorgeous wife. I've completely forgotten all about that. I love her. I want to see her. And so his heart is warm to her. God turns it wherever he wishes. And that's just not King Ahasuerus. That's all world leaders. He will turn them one way or another because he already has everything all worked out. There's already a finished end. He knows every single detail between now and the end of the earth. Let's look at what Pastor Robert Deffenbaugh has to say about God's sovereignty. He's a pastor in California, and for me, as a young pastor and as somebody starting a Bible study in New York City, which went for 20 years. He was a great mentor to me through his writings. And so he says, the book of Esther is but one of many biblical examples of this truth. God has a plan which he purposed before the earth existed. He is constantly and progressively working out this plan in history. He employs pagans like Haman and Ahasuerus, whose motives are far from godly and whose actions often should not serve as examples. He employs the sins of men and their rebellion against him and his people to further his purpose. Nothing, let me repeat that, nothing hinders or interrupts his plan. Nothing hinders or interrupts his plan. God is in control, even when men are doing their best to deny or defeat God's promises and purposes. One more time, nothing hinders or interrupts his plan. If that's the case, then we should just submit to his plan and say, God knows best, and I submit to his plan. As Job said, though he slay me, yet I will worship him. And here's another Deffenbach quote, the providence of God. God's providence is very closely related to his sovereignty. The sovereignty of God refers to God's independence from men and his power and ability to achieve his purposes through all men, meaning believing and unbelieving, saved or lost, obedient or disobedient. The providence of God, as I understand this concept, refers to the way in which God works. The providence of God is his invisible hand working that which accomplishes his purposes and promises, but which is not recognized as his work. So we're going to see God's providential hand. Let's just take it all the way back to the beginning. Esther is an orphan, a young girl orphan in that society that is less than a nobody. And by God's providence, she ends up being the queen of Persia. And there are all kinds of evidence of his providence just in the eunuch Haggai, singling her out, giving her special attention, giving her extra handmaidens, giving her a luxurious apartment to be in. All of these things helped her to be comfortable when she went into King Ahasuerus. And then King Ahasuerus, he's not even done auditioning all these girls, and it says he loved her. He loved her, and he made her queen immediately. So this again is God's providential hand. Then we have Mordecai finding out about the assassination attempt on King Ahasuerus and telling Esther and having her warn him and having that recorded in the books. It's going to come up. It's going to be a pivotal issue. It's going to be a catharsis for King Ahasuerus, who doesn't have many of them. So all of these things are showing God's providential hand all through this book. And we see 1 million people worshiping God, fasting and in sackcloth and ashes. So when people tell you it's the only book in the Bible that doesn't mention God, all right, the word God is not here, okay? But God's presence is all through this. So what's the point? I don't think there's a good point. All right, our prayer today is a prayer by Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. I have a reason for choosing it today, and Here we go. God, give us leaders. A time like this demands great leaders. Leaders whom the lust of office does not kill. Leaders whom the spoils of office cannot buy. Leaders who possess opinions and a will. Leaders who have honor. Leaders who will not lie. Leaders who can stand before a demagogue and damn his treacherous flatteries without winking. Tall leaders who live above the fog in public duty and in private thinking. Amen. Well, we sure have had a lot of bad leaders, and bad leaders convinced the CIA to take this man's life, to take John F. Kennedy's life, to take Robert F. Kennedy's life. These are all three wonderful American leaders who were killed by our government. The CIA coerced by leadership above them. And this is all coming out. The JFK files, 80,000 pages, were made public this week. And more of this information is coming out. We're going to find out that our government has not been run in a godly way. It has been run in a satanic way. And these powerful people not only took innocent life, but lied to us about it for decades. And the fact that we didn't question these lies, and the fact that the legacy media promoted these lies, made people in our government believe we can tell these fools anything and they'll believe it. And so they did. And they stole from us. And they worked against us. And they were all working with Big Pharma and with the World Economic Forum to end our constitutional republic in 2030. That's 5 years from now. Some of them still believe that they're going to be able to do that. And if that's God's plan, there's nothing we can do about it. But I don't believe it is. I believe God has listened to the remnant praying before this 24 election, praying for 3 years under the grotesque government of Joe Biden. So, much like the book of Esther, we see God's hand all over this. And I'm trusting in God that He will lead us to being a shining city on a hill once again, and the new Jerusalem, which will save the planet and bring positivity, honesty in terms of dealing with other governments and other countries, and a chance for everybody to be blessed. God bless you, and thank you for studying Esther with us.